It's as if the writer of the psalm is saying that there are so many reasons to be grateful. How could we possibly count them all? And yet, if we don't, what are we missing? How have we overlooked? So this Sunday, I'm going to issue a 14-day challenge to begin each day with one reason to give thanks. And if each of us could do this for 14 days, by the end of 2 weeks, or 2 weeks from today, we might see at least 1,000 reasons. And as you entered into the sanctuary last week, the ushers, they gave you a fabric leaf like this. And each leaf was to represent one reason that you have to be thankful. And you had the power to bring color and life to the tree that's behind me. And look at all the thanks we got last week. And if you didn't get one, there are plenty extras, and there was a basket going around, and I hope everybody got one. And there's some magic markers also in the pews, and if you don't have a leaf, you can fill one out later and just drop it into the offering basket later on this afternoon, or as the service goes on, or just put it up here on the altar afterwards. And you can write down your reasons there and represented by these leaves, and just leave them in the offering plate. And it is okay to write more than one, so if you did one last week, please feel free to take another one. There are those markers, so you can write them down. And it's making visible what often remains invisible. Each of us holds this power, this unseen power, often underestimated or underutilized or ignored. And each of us holds this hidden power that could change the trajectory of life. And it's the power of gratitude. So this past week, it occurred to me that some of us actually have a perfect example of what gratitude looks like. And Lisa would know this. It's a pet. Now, I've always had a dog, until fairly recently, that is, and I realized that a dog continually shows you what gratitude looks like. Maybe you've heard this before. It's called The Diary of a Dog and a Cat. First comes the dog. 8 o'clock a.m., dog food, my favorite thing. 9:30 a.m., a car ride, my favorite thing. 9:40 a.m., a walk in the park, my favorite thing. 10:30 a.m., get rubbed and petted, my favorite thing. 12 o'clock p.m., milk bones, my favorite thing. 1 o'clock p.m., played in the yard, my favorite thing. 3 o'clock, wagged my tail, my favorite thing. 5 o'clock, dinner, my favorite thing. 8 o'clock p.m., wow, watch TV with the people, my favorite thing. 11 o'clock p.m., sleeping on the bed, my favorite thing. And then here's the cat's diary, just one entry. Day 983, another day of captivity. You see, I think our perspective matters. An attitude of gratitude matters. You see, the writer of the psalm is saying, just look at my life. It may be far from perfect, but everything might not be going well, but I am blessed, and I'm grateful. And I remember what I was actually going to say originally to you at the beginning of this service. It was about the opening hymn, and it was written by Martin Rinkart, who wrote those words, "Now thank we all our God," during the 17th century. And he was a German pastor, and he was serving as a pastor of a small church in a small town during what's known as the 30-Year War that encompassed much of the continent of Europe. And one year he conducted 4,000 funerals. And one of them was for his own wife. And in the midst of that, he wrote the words to the hymn, "Now thank we all our God." You see, it's not based on the circumstances of life. Gratitude has the power to move beyond circumstances of life. And that's why I think it's important for us, and it's an important place for us to begin. And it's most definitely, gratitude is an important place for us to begin whenever we have a discussion about personal finances. Because frankly, when it comes to some of our finances, gratitude is most definitely not what we're thinking about. I mean, what we have and what we don't have, what we want and what we need, for some, it's just really hard to look at our finances. It can be depressing to us. I mean, where is our heart on this? What's the condition of your heart? Jesus said, "For where your treasure is, that is where your money is, there your heart will be also." And that's why I found that looking at my checkbook or my monthly bank statement is a really good reality check for me. Because where my money is going is a reflection of what I value. Quite often I realize that is what I say I value is not where my money is going. I mean, where's my heart? And then it's important for me to remember who I've been listening to. I mean, some of us were raised in homes where there was no healthy financial practices at all. I mean, if you wanted something, you got it. If you couldn't afford it, well, you financed it. And so debt was a part of living, and it was a part of an every month struggle to try and balance and sort out what do we pay this month and what do we not pay this month. I mean, some of us grew up in a home where greed was our guide, and it was an effort to be rich, always wanting more, never having enough. And I mean, some of us grew up in homes where either we were influenced or our parents were influenced by the Depression years, where there was a sense of scarcity and fear that there would never be enough. And it influenced our perspective on finances. And some of us had absolutely no financial teaching whatsoever. It's a difficult topic for us to talk about. In fact, it might be easier for us to talk about sex than about money. So last week we began with this parable, a parable that Jesus told. It's found in the 16th chapter of Luke, and it's the story of a landowner and his business manager. And the message we took from this parable is that God is the owner and we are the managers. I mean, it's not my house. It's not my car. It's not my bank account. It's not my credit cards. It belongs to God. I'm just the manager. A pastor friend of mine told me last year that he had taken a flight to Chicago from Midway Airport, in Midway Airport, and he took a shuttle to the car rental desk. And as he had reserved a intermediate-sized car there. And after they did all the paperwork and went out to the lot with the rental cars, the attendant told him that they were out of intermediate cars. So for the same price, he could take any car on the lot. Well, he said it had to be his lucky day, because now was his chance to drive a nicer car than he usually drives. So he picked a nicer car. And he didn't want to pick the nicest car because someone else was paying his expenses, and he didn't want people to think that the pastor showed up in the nicest car. So the car was almost new, but he remembered the importance of checking the condition of the car before leaving the lot. And he noticed a few scratches on the back bumper, which he reported to the attendant and made sure that they were documented. And as he left the parking lot, he said he was in heaven. It felt great driving that car, and for the next 2 days he enjoyed driving that car, but he was extra careful. He paid attention to where he was parking. He didn't want any more scratches on his watch because that car didn't belong to him. He was just the renter. He was just the manager. And when I listened to him, it reminded me about how I was using what God had entrusted to me. And when I think about that and allow that to shape my relationship with my money and my possessions, it influences what I do with what's been given to me. Now, at the end of that parable from Luke chapter 16, here's what Jesus said. "For the people of this world are more shrewd," that is, they're more clever or they're smarter. "For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are people of the light." In other words, we need smart financial practices. And Jesus is saying that those who don't even believe in God may actually be smarter with their financial practices than are people who say, well, God will provide. God will take care of it. I don't need to be concerned about the future. I don't need to be concerned with what I'm doing and how I'm using the money that I have, because God will provide. God will take care of me. But I think Jesus is really saying, is that God will not do for us what God, through His Word, has already directed us to do. I mean, God will not rescue us if we have failed to do what God has already told us to do. We need smart financial practices. Last week I spoke to my friend John Thomas, who's my own personal financial planner. And I asked him about the challenges that he sees as he works with people and families to help them make smart financial practices. And he said that he thinks that there are a lot of challenges that people face as they are trying to work through their own financial situation, but he thinks that there's a very common theme that he sees with people and they struggle with. And it's this need for instant gratification. And this need for people to spend money in order for them to feel happy. And that seems to be the number one underlying theme when people start to get in trouble and to start not to be in a financial situation that they are happy with. And when this happens, what John sees is that people are really unprepared. They are unprepared for the future. They haven't saved enough in their emergency fund, or they haven't saved enough for other bumps in the road. Maybe they want to retire, but they haven't saved enough to do that. And so that seems to be the underlying theme that kind of presents these challenges that people face. You know, John Wesley, the founder of Methodist movement in 18th century England, offered 3 simple rules for the Christian's use of money. And I think these 3 simple rules work for us still today. And I know some of you have heard these before. His first rule is earn all you can without bringing harm to yourself or to your neighbor. And then save all you can. Avoid waste and unnecessary luxuries. And then thirdly, give all you can. He said, do not limit yourself to a proportion, that is, a percent. And do not give God a tenth or even a half of what God already owns. But give all that is God's by using your wealth to preserve yourself and your family, the church, and the rest of humanity. In other words, Wesley was saying we need a plan. So what is your plan in relationship to your money? Again, I asked my friend John how we get started in establishing a plan, and he said that a financial plan is critical. You hear a lot of financial planners talk about just having a really good foundation, and that foundation includes having a really good cash reserve and a really good positive cash flow. And knowing what is coming in is just as important as knowing what's going out. And then the next step is taking a good look and asking yourself, what is the most important thing in your life? And he encourages people, if they haven't done this, to go through this exercise where you narrow down the top 5 values and the things that are critically important to you. And a decision can be a lot more difficult. That decision can be more difficult than what it really seems. And with his clients, he gives them a long list with many different words on it, such as security or spirituality or your community or your family. All sorts of different core values that people may put some importance on. And then whenever you are making your financial decisions, you can take a look at those core values and make decisions based upon those values. And it's really good to share those values with a professional, like a financial advisor or someone else that can actually hold you accountable to those values. So what are our values and priorities? I mean, do we know where our money is going? And does where it's going align with our values and our priorities? Because for so many of us, we just don't know. We have a sense of where our values and priorities might be, but we aren't so sure that our money is aligned with those values and priorities. And without a plan and without goals, we just don't know. And quite often when we have a plan and we know where our values and priorities are, we suddenly discover that we have more money than we thought we had. So I encourage you this week to sit down and have a conversation with your spouse, or if you live alone, sit down and write down 5 of your most important values and priorities when it comes to your finances. I mean, what are your goals? And then take a look at your money. Are your funds going where your values and your priorities exist? Do they align with those values? You know, each year I have a conversation with my financial advisor and I review my plan. And the main reason I do that is to have somebody hold me accountable. Am I living accordingly? Well, Wesley's 3 rules. Earn all you can. Earn all you can. You know, it's what I found out early in my life, is the more that I have, the easier it is for me to spend it. I mean, when I first moved out on my own, and then in the early years of my son's life, I lived paycheck to paycheck, and I lived month by month. I was paid the first day of every month, and I would sit down on the first day of every single month and plan out every single penny to see how we could make it to the end of the month. And I also discovered early on that life doesn't always go according to plan. The unexpected will happen, and so I learned the importance of actually living on less than my income. In other words, I learned the importance of spending less than I make. And I heard someone say once, act your wage, not your age, but act your wage. Because otherwise there was this temptation to slip into this other thing called credit cards. And I'm a little embarrassed to say that I slipped into temptation quite a bit more often than I'd like to admit, and I leaned on credit cards. And you know, the average American with credit cards has a debt of $15,950. And here's the problem with credit card debt. Let's say you have $15,950 in debt, and let's say your credit card comes with an annual interest rate of 18%. Now, some cards with an interest rate are as high as 29%. And let's say you have this $15,950, and for each month you're making this minimum payment, which would be just under $400 a month, every month making that minimum payment. It would take you 388 months to pay off $15,950. That's more than 32 years. And in the process, you'd be paying an interest rate of more than $23,000 on top of the $15,950. I mean, that's why they keep sending us these credit card promotions in the mail. Or let's look at it a different way. Let's say you took $400 every month. Instead of paying it to the credit card company, you took that $400 and you invested that amount. At the end of 32 years, that investment at an 8% interest, perhaps, a little aggressive, but not out of line. At the end of that time period, you'd have more than $700,000. $700,000 for yourself or for your lender, perhaps. So I asked John what somebody can do if they can find themselves underwater in debt. And here's what he said. When people find themselves underwater in debt, it can be overwhelming, even to the point of paralysis. And what he says to people is, okay, this seems to be a big elephant in the room, but we're just going to take it one bite at a time. And once he can start breaking it down for them and saying, well, you can adjust this and you can adjust this, sometimes they can even find money that they didn't even realize they had. For example, they can reduce their cable bill or change their car insurance, and suddenly they have $100 a month that they didn't know they had. And they can actually chip away at that debt. You know, John Wesley didn't have to deal with credit cards, but back then they had debtor's prison. If you couldn't pay your bills, you went to prison. And how easy was it to pay your bills from prison? Not too easy. I mean, you had to rely on somebody from the outside and to pay your bills for you. And they didn't throw you in prison back then. They threw you and your entire family in prison. So debt is really not a recent occurrence. So I think Wesley is saying, earn all you can. But once we get our debt under control, then save all we can. And that means starting perhaps a $1,000 emergency fund, and once that's in place, setting aside 3 months of our salary, and then start putting into some kind of savings or retirement fund, you know, maybe 6 to 10% of your income. And you know, the National Institute on Retirement Security reports that 1/3 of the baby boom generation, that's the generation that is currently retiring and reaching the age of retirement right now. 1/3 of those baby boomers have $0 set aside for retirement. I mean, they're going to rely on Social Security, right? And some of you are receiving Social Security, and it will surprise you that it might not provide quite as much as you think it does. So 1/3, $0 for retirement. Another 1/3 has saved up 1 year's salary for their retirement. Now, some of us are going to live to 25 or more years after their retirement, and the interest on 1 year's salary is going to provide very little that will supplement what Social Security is providing. Now, if you happen to be in your 50s or even in your 60s, it's not too late to get started. But if you happen to be in your 20s or your 30s, my advice is get started as soon as possible. 3 years ago, my son called so excited about an unexpected bonus that he'd received from his employer. And it was the first time he'd ever been given a big bonus. And he said, "Wow, Mom, what am I going to do with all this money?" And I said, "This is my advice. Pay off your student loan. And then set up a 401k retirement plan, and only then start spending on yourself. Because the temptation is to spend on ourselves first. And boy, did I know from experience." And I'm very proud to say that he actually listened. At just 30 years old, his entire student loan is completely paid off, and he has set up a 401k retirement plan, and he's managed to get his credit score up in the 700s, too. However, he's simply the manager. So earn all you can, save all you can, and then you're able to give all you can. Wesley's point was that everything we have belongs to God. I'm not the owner. What will I do with what God has given to me? And if I have figured our relationship with my money and possessions, and I know what my true values and priorities are, and I'm living into these first two rules, earn all you can and save all you can, then the third one comes easy. And it brings the greatest satisfaction and joy of the three simple rules. King Solomon is the Bible's greatest example of what happens. Money and possessions become the meaning of your aim of your life. And as a young man, Solomon became king, and he was filled with promise and potential, and he had God's favor on his side. He didn't pray for wealth or power, but wisdom. Do you remember that story from a few weeks ago? He wanted to honor God, and he led the building of the temple in Jerusalem. He wanted to build a place to honor God, and so he built it to look like a palace, recognizing God as Israel's king. His wisdom and his faithfulness to God brought blessing after blessing in his life, but then something happened to Solomon that still happens to many people today. He forgot that he wasn't the owner, that he was just the manager. And as his blessing increased, he gradually forgot the meaning of his life. And the more he had, the more his life became caught up in having more. He built a grand temple for God, but what he built for himself was even grander. 1 Kings chapters 10 and 11 describes Solomon's insatiable desire for more. He had 14,000 chariots, 12,000 horses, 700 wives, 300 concubines. Do you remember that? Why? I mean, we're told he had gold cups rather than silver because silver wasn't good enough for a king. And the Bible tells us that by the end of his life, as Solomon grew old, he wasn't committed to the Lord his God with all his heart. Now, we don't know for sure who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, but it seems to capture the spirit of King Solomon, especially at the end of his life. So hear these words again that you heard a little bit earlier from Don, as if they were from King Solomon. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. What a sad and pathetic ending to a life that had been filled with so much promise and potential. And if you know your history, Solomon began the downward spiral then and led a nation of Israel towards chaos and destruction. Now, contrast Solomon's perspective with that of John Wesley. When Wesley was a student at Oxford University, he sat down to determine how much he would need to live off of. And what he determined was that he would need 28 pounds and anything over and above he would give to the poor. And he decided to do that for the rest of his life. First year, he made 30 pounds, and he lived off 28, and he gave 2 pounds away. He said, for the rest of my life, I will only live on 28 pounds. And so he reached the point one year toward the end of his life where he made 1,500 pounds, mostly through the sale of his books. But Wesley, who had determined how much was enough, only lived on the 28 pounds and gave away 1,472. You know, Jesus has posed this question to us. What will we do with what God has given us? One last thing, several years ago, a woman walked into my church office and she asked for help. Now, she wasn't part of the church, and she had just moved into the neighborhood, and she had left an abusive relationship, and she was expecting her first child. And everything she owned was in a storage unit, and because her ex-husband did not keep up with the rent on the storage unit, she lost everything she had. She hadn't even given she had no items at all in her apartment, not one single thing, and she sat down in my office asking for help. I need help. Could I help her? Could this church help her? And so that day we stepped forward to help her. And I don't remember how much money we gave her, and I do remember that we collected some furniture, and I remember the day we delivered it to her apartment. And a few days later, I received a letter. And it's this letter, and inside this letter was $53. And here's what she wrote. She says, Dear Mrs. Lauren, I just want to be obedient to the Lord and his word in Malachi. How he says it is in the best interest of his children to pay our tithes and offerings. It's a sacrifice, and I only have $4 until October 30th. Now, this letter was dated September 30th. She said, it's easy to trust a God when you have a regular paycheck coming in from working, but I tell you, it's hard to trust God when you receive only $530 per month and not even hardly providing for your family. I hadn't paid my tithes in a while, so I decided I need a change and God's favor in my life. Thank you for all you did for me and for my baby. Please use this to bless somebody else. You know, it's easy to trust God when we have a regular paycheck coming in from working, but I tell you, it's hard to trust God when you only have the $530 a month. I'm not the owner. I'm just the manager. What will we do with what God has given to us? Let's pray. O loving and generous God, we thank you for the gift of this day and for the great blessing of life itself. Help me to honor you with my life, to be a good manager of what you have entrusted to me. Help me to be grateful and to look to you each and every single day. In Jesus' name, amen.